From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics in the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions. Today is something a little bit different. By happy coincidence, the other podcast that I run, which is called Comps List Radio and is on the H-Pole network, was doing an episode this week on Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And I thought, that's something that our audience might enjoy. So I've cross-posted that episode here. A little bit about Comps List Radio. It's a podcast where we do deep dives into classics of the American historical tradition. So, for instance, we did C. Van Woodward's Origins of the New South. So, if you're interested in those longer discussions about American history as an intellectual tradition, I encourage you to check it out. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. That's Comps List Radio, COMPS List Radio. I hope you enjoy this episode. It was really interesting. There were four of us on it, and yeah, I think you'll really appreciate it and get something out of it. So without further ado, enjoy. From H-Pole World Headquarters on the World Wide Web, this is Comps List Radio with Robert Ferguson and Marie Totten, and joined today by the broader H-Pole universe. We have Akriti Sethi and Grant Madsen. This is, I guess it's the first episode of season 2 of Comps List Radio. So that's very exciting. We're on to a new academic year. It's a balmy 118 degrees here in Tempe, Arizona. Akriti, what's it like outside of Delhi?
It's extremely humid. We had a couple of rainy days, so now it's pretty humid.
I can imagine. Um, Marie, Conway, Arkansas, checking in from just outside of Conway, Arkansas. How's middle Arkansas?
It's hot. It's been stormy. We've been out of power. So glad to be here. Glad to have power. Glad to be on season 2. Here we go.
Well, we haven't been canceled yet.
Not yet.
And Grant, Provo, Utah. How are things there?
It's I'm sort of surprised. We're the coolest, I think, of every place. We're only 82 degrees right now and very sunny. It's a beautiful day. So sorry you guys aren't all here where we get cooler and dry heat. So anyway.
We got hit with a massive dust storm last night. Like a true big haboob came in and and rattled our windows for like a good 45 minutes. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the joys of living in central, or in the Valley of the Sun is that our storms are actually quite scary sometimes when we get them. Anyways, so this is the first episode of season 2. Probably because it's the first episode of the season, I guess we should probably introduce ourselves a little bit. Grant and Akriti have been on previous episodes. Marie and I, for those of you who are just joining us, are your usual co-pilots. We know you have lots of listening options when it comes to podcasts, so we appreciate you choosing ours. The purpose of the podcast, as initially kind of designed, is that we are a political history group at H-Pole. That's our job, to be stewards of political history. And we realize that there's a lot of books that I think previous generation read a lot of and inspired them that haven't trickled down through the comps list, just as there's been a proliferation of writing in the last 20 or 30 years. But I think there's sort of been an assumed knowledge of what's in those books that I just think has been lost. And so we're trying to recover that and just help graduate students and early scholars on some level engage with some of these classical ideas, and hopefully be able to either integrate it into their own work, better understand them, and maybe better understand some of the other stuff that's actually on their comps lists. And do it in a fairly digestible format. That's at least the goal. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. And yeah, I guess my what I usually research and write about is the South, agriculture, and foreign affairs, and the institutional politics that kind of mediates in between. Marie, can you tell the fine listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, and you did such a great job explaining the purpose of the podcast as well. And hopefully we're reaching that audience at this point. But I'm Marie Totten. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the University of Central Arkansas, and I am a political biographer. And I'm currently working on a political biography of a Arkansas segregationist. So in the South as well, although you and I do often travel outside of the South when we are talking about these works.
Yeah, we are not a Southern specific podcast, although when you and I both end up with a Southern work, we tend to get a little maybe it gets a little granular.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, Akriti, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're joining us from a long way away. So
Yeah. So, hi, it's nice to be here with you all. My name is Akriti Sethi, and I am basically a research associate at VIF New Delhi. And I'm also in the process of finishing my PhD from Center of Study of Americas, JNU, New Delhi. And currently at VIF, I am actively covering the midterms. So that's something that's been on my radar. But it's always a pleasure to be with you all.
well, you know, Akriti, I'm glad you brought that up because so I told the people I told our everybody on the podcast that I'm going to be cross posting this with another podcast that I do. And I'm going to have to get you on that because we're doing midterm coverage a little more narrowly there. So I think it would be really good to have you on there. So for those who are listening, so for those from the Politics of the Past audience, welcome. Glad you're here. And hopefully that's whets your appetite for a future episode of Politics of the Past. But anyway, Grant, can you tell the fine people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm an associate professor at Brigham Young University in the history department. I do a lot of economic, political, and intellectual history with like everybody kind of in my generation with you had to be sort of international in your focus if you wanted to get a job when I went on the job market. So that's true for me too. And I'm super happy to be with all of you. It's very nice of you, Rob and Maria, to let Akriti and me into the fold, as it were, right, to join you. So this is going to be fun, I think.
Well, it should be. I admit that doing so was a little bit doing this was a little bit selfishly. We are sort of hoping that we could, ease our own burdens here. Um, so this episode, this episode began, I think, talking about this episode a long time ago because we were trying to figure out what we thought the most important book was for political historians in the United States. And Grant and his wonderful research assistant put together a list of about 400 books that he thought were sort of germane to the topic. And we all kind of, I think, in consensus agreed that this was the most important book. And that's Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Now, I don't know how much peer pressure was involved in that. Like, after four people say that that's the number one book, is the fifth person going to really disagree at that point?
Well, it might be one of those situations where we all had a book that we thought was more important, but that Tocqueville ended up, sort of top five enough so that he just sort of on average ended up at the top. So
If we board accounted this enough, it was going to end up with Tocqueville at the top.
right.
But that was a shout out to our social choice listeners, if they're because I'm sure there's a lot of big fans of like Ken Arrow that are listening to this right now. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of where it came from. Um, let me start with before we get too far into the book itself, I'm going to actually try to like be a little more intentional. It's the word the kids use, right? As to how I actually pilot this a little bit. So, Marie, are you able to can you tell us a little bit about Alexis de Tocqueville and where this book, Democracy in America, actually came from?
Yes. So Tocqueville was born in 1805. He came from an aristocratic family in France. His family barely survived the terror in France I read his great grandfather was actually guillotined. His parents were imprisoned. And so he grew up in that era. He grew up seeing that. So the potential and then how that potential played out in France, essentially, is what he's looking at. He's a lawyer by training. He went on in the 1830s to visit the United States. I think he was 24, 25 years old when he came to the United States in 1831. And he brought an associate with him, and he was looking mostly at the prison system, or that was the idea. The idea was he was going to come and look at the prison system. And he did give a report. He wrote a report after he left the United States on the prison system, but it's going to be these 2 volumes, Democracy in America, the first and the second, that are going to be the work that come out of this trip. And he's looking at he's looking at democracy in America. He's looking at these Enlightenment ideas and seeing how they have played out on the ground, essentially, in these works. And I think that one of the reasons we may think this is the most important work is so many political historians respond to this in some way. Either they use some of these ideas in their work. I mean, some of these ideas come straight from the Enlightenment, so we hear them there. And we hear them in other works as well. So his ideas, even if you don't know it's Tocqueville, his ideas are in a lot of the work that we've talked about and that we will talk about in the future. And so I do think that this work is important, even though there are some issues. He's writing this during Jacksonian America. He's writing this during the Second Great Awakening. It's a particular time and place. And he's writing this for the French to show, okay, this has happened here. Can this happen in France? Can we have this type of democracy in France? So he's asking this question from the very beginning. Now, Americans love this, especially New Englanders, because he adores them in a way. He writes these glowing passages about how democracy has worked in New England, and I know we'll talk about some of this, the reasons why he thinks that this has worked. But I think that's a good overview, a good starting point of the context of these volumes.
That's great. I think that's really great. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna probably dig into this a little bit, but he's coming to the United States in the wake of the 1830 revolution in France, which is a liberal revolution, and after the kind of the return to autocracy under Charles X. So again, it's this sort of like, okay, so we're back. We kind of feel like maybe we're back in the 1780s a little bit, early 1790s in France. How can we prevent that from going the bloody way the first one did and ending with a Napoleon?
Right.
So I think that's, yeah, Marie, I think you touched on I think what's really important here is that he is speaking to to a French audience and asking a French question.
Right.
Right. So Grant, um, how when did you first encounter Tocqueville? Let me start with that.
Yeah, so probably not until actually, I want to answer that a couple different ways. That's a good question. So I would say um Tocqueville in some ways is just in the water, right? You don't even recognize it in the United States. Like
Yeah.
the Tocquevillian account of America, the development of the United States is not all that different from, for those who are old like me, Schoolhouse Rock. I don't know if you remember this, either of those cartoons. I mean, if you
Yeah.
go back and you read Tocqueville, you're like, oh yeah, like this is what Schoolhouse Rock told me. Kind of this account of the development of American institutions that starts with the Puritans, that's rooted in sort of town hall democracy, that's very associational and civic minded as a result of those associations. All of that, that is what I understood the history of the country to be. And, and so going back and rereading Tocqueville as we did to prep for this, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I see it more clearly now, like that this was just kind of how I understood the country growing up. It all felt very familiar in a lot of ways. Which I think is, I mean, I know we're probably going to talk about this more, which is how do historians make use of Tocqueville, right? Because there's like sort of like the account Tocqueville gives that I think is useful in some ways. There's also all the descriptive things he's doing that are really useful, make him a great primary source document and so on. So I would say, in an informal sense, Tocqueville is the water I swam in as a child, and then didn't start to realize the source of that in some ways, until grad school and started reading him. But the interesting thing, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I bet most of us came to Tocqueville piecemeal, right? He covers so much ground that, Tocqueville, the primary source was probably the first way I encountered him, and that was mostly, uh, for whatever weird reason, through feminist writings, where his notion of separate spheres and all the rest is super useful, and sort of the gender analysis he made of the country. And then later, sort of the associational approach, and then after that, some things I know we're going to talk about, some of the warnings about the dangers, the downsides of democracy, and then probably later than that, rereading him, reading him against the grain to say like how exceptional really is the United States. So anyway, there are a lot of ways to encounter him, and a lot of ways I feel like I've had to reread him and re-understand him over years. But anyway, so that's my long story with hopefully a lot of hooks for us to talk about stuff moving forward.
No, I think that's really good. Akriti, you were educated in India, which is a long way away from the United States, although you're an American, professional. But what did when in your life did you encounter Tocqueville, or it was 3 weeks ago when I assigned this the first time?
No, so I think it was during my postgraduate days. So one of my uh associate professor, he was still new, just fresh out of college, just finished his PhD, so he had a lot of passion. And I think we were his first batch. So he came in the class with a lot of insight about Hollywood and about whatever he thinks of America. And I was always fascinated with America, but I think that was when I heard the term Tocqueville. And I think because of him, I ended up really diving deep into the literature. And when I graduated, he gifted me his copy, which he bought of Tocqueville. And I still have that. And that definitely came in handy. So I think it started from there, but uh, it took me a lot of years to properly understand what that literature was all about, because I think at that time I was still young, still trying to understand this field. I don't, I won't be cocky enough to say that I understand it now. I think it's one of those texts you're gonna always go back to, but I definitely understand it a little bit better than what I did back in the day. So I think that's my Tocqueville story.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm Canadian, for those who don't know. I'll give you I thought it was Tocqueville until not that long ago. Because in Canada, a toque is a winter hat, like a beanie. Americans might know it as a beanie or a toboggan, depending on where you're from. And we call it a toque, and it's spelled Toque. There's no C in it, but it's spelled Toque. So I just assumed it was Tocqueville. So yeah, it wasn't until actually embarrassingly recently, like it wasn't last year, but it was within the last decade that I actually realized it was Tocqueville. Because people were talking about this Tocqueville guy that I had no idea who they were referring to. So that's the kind of expertise that you're going to get by listening to this podcast. Okay, well, I think Grant touched on some really important questions that I'd really like to discuss. Maybe we try to focus on the some of the arguments that he's actually making, and then we'll kind of approach it from how do historians treat this, and then thirdly, okay, what are the warnings here that he's talked about? So, um, Grant, do you want to tell us like what is his overall argument?
Wow.
I mean,
Okay.
it's a big argument, and there's several arguments. I want to be clear, but what do you think is maybe his most salient argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think most interpreters would say, and you already laid it out. What are in some ways, the downsides to a society dedicated to equality? right? Like, if you're gonna make that sort of like the organizing principle of social life, what are the consequences of that, right? And I think Rob, you and Marie both kind of pointed out already. He's seen how that can go off the rails, right? He's lived through the French Revolution, and so he's aware of how bad that can get. And so then the core question is, like you said, so is that happening in the United States? Will that happen in the United States? And if the answer is no, why not? Right. So those are the core questions. And I think why we really like him is that he's really nuanced about about what the consequences are for thinking of everybody as essentially equal, and consequences in terms of like getting stuff done, right? Like how do you organize building a road, or or just having any kind of governance when everybody sort of feels like they are equal. And so that's, I think, one of the core questions is, if you don't have a hierarchy, how do you actually organize social action? Right. So we'd say political scientists would say, he's encountering a collective action problem in some ways. How do that sort of thing, right? So that's one of the things he thinks through. And anyway, so with that kind of in mind, he ends up with these really interesting, very nuanced arguments about this is why it's working, and this is how it can go off the rails, right? So one of the things he wants to say is it works. One of the things that's a challenge with being equal is that it tends to atomize individual citizens, right? So that's where the collective action problem comes. If we're all equal individuals, why do we ever combine together to collectively solve a problem? But then he has this fascinating account of it's exactly our weakness that brings us together, right? It creates a recognition that I only can get stuff done if I combine with my fellow citizens, and that's why associations end up being such an important part of his analysis. Is that's where it teaches us how to cooperate and how to come together. And he says, well, equality also, but that also highlights that kind of individual weakness, which maybe will drive some of us towards what he calls kind of a soft despotism, right? Like, maybe in the interest of this solving this collective action problem, we will give over some of our liberty to the state in order to protect us and care for us. And so there is a danger and I think that's, again, so his analysis is always kind of good news, bad news, right? Here's how it can go wrong. Here's how Americans have solved it, but here's how it can still go wrong. That sort of thing. So I don't know if I'm not covering all of the key points, I'm sure, but that's the problem, at least. I think he treats democracy as a problem as much as a sociological fact, right? And so it's what are the ways democracy solves certain issues, but what are some of the issues that it keeps that it will raise as well in terms of just how to organize a peaceful, successful, society.
Yeah, I think that's a really good. Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to exactly what what the problem is that he's trying to solve, or what are the broader problems that he's trying to solve. What are the opportunities? What are the limitations of what it actually means if everybody is equal? And of course, he's writing in Jacksonian America, and we know not everybody is equal then, but it is a universal white manhood suffrage. Um, and in some states, it's actually universal suffrage. But of course, that's got the great story of the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Hold on, why don't you let? And the question was like, why don't you let black people vote? And the guy says it is, he's first they are absolutely able to vote. They have the right. They just know that their fellow citizens will be really upset if they do.
Right. Right. Well, no, and you raise an interesting question. And one of the things I also want to mention is, you may know more about this, but I think it's really interesting that he starts with I mean, I guess as an aristocrat, he would start with equality rather than freedom, but he sees the freedom as emerging from equality, not the other way around, right? And and maybe that's because the Declaration of Independence puts him in that order, right? All men are created equal, and then the rights follow from that. But it seems to me that most people, well, I shouldn't say most, but But then a lot of critics of America, people that worry about the kinds of problems he worries about, start with the freedom problem, and say, well, if you let everybody do what they want, that's why you have collective action problems. Is people are too free. But he says no. The problem is they're too equal, and you're right, Rob. It is kind of an ironic thing at that particular moment because I think from our vantage we say it wasn't all that equal. But I suppose he could come back and say, yeah, but as an organizing principle, we keep coming back to equality as a core
Right.
political issue and so
Right.
on.
Well, you had people voting in the United States that had no political rights anywhere else in the world, right? You'd have, mechanics in Philadelphia voting who would have never who had that I mean, we don't realize until I can't remember the first year of the great reforms of the UK. Is it 1836? And Tocqueville's writing before that, right? And I mean, like the actual like voter rolls in England, which is also one of the most democratic, or the UK, which is one of the most democratic places in the world in the 1830s, or with some of the broadest political rights in the world in the 1830s. And like the voter lists are minuscule before the great reforms begin in 36. And so, I mean, yeah, I mean, universal white manhood suffrage is not exactly perfectly equal, but from Tocqueville's perspective, it would appear very equal, especially with his priors on certain other things.
Yeah, and with the people who are with him as he's touring America. He's with lawyers and other elite who are showing him certain aspects of the United States that he wouldn't get if he was with a common working man or even spent time with a poor woman or an enslaved person. So I mean, that matters a lot when looking at Tocqueville and looking at this work, that he's going to get what they show him. And that's what they're showing him, and it looks much more equal than what he's seeing in Europe as well. So, absolutely, his experience here would suggest, this fight between equality and the idea that we need to give up some of our rights for protection. I know he doesn't use that word, but for like a larger government, larger protection overall, and this kind of push and pull. And in the United States, he sees that pull toward equality. And like Grant said, eventually, after equality comes freedom. He also, something that Grant said about the collective action problem, one of the things that he says in here is that if everyone is equal to have a role and a say in government, then they are going to act collectively. They are going to act ideally for the public good. And that's what he's saying in these townships where you have, according to Tocqueville, everyone being able to talk about problems and decide how to handle those problems at the very, very local level. So they have some buy-in to what's going on. They have some buy-in to their government. They're learning how to do government in real time as this is playing out. And I think this is one of the really strong arguments that he makes here is the township and then the associations, that just to follow up on what Grant was saying earlier.
Creedy, um, his overall argument about what we're getting at here in inequality. Does this is this sort of an argument that would resonate for people living in India?
Um, to some extent. But then I think whenever I think about Tocqueville, first of all, I think before this podcast, I never thought about Tocqueville from an Indian lens. I think it was only when I revisited the text I actually started thinking. So, um, before I go ahead, let me just say that I haven't gone through my own thoughts completely. It's all fragmented in my own head. But maybe after this podcast, I'll have a bit more clarity. But I think if I think it from the India context, I think there are some things that really stood out for me. I did not necessarily resolve inequality bit, but I think in terms of similarities, or if I have to connect it with India, I think so. First of all, I think Tocqueville's core proposition is that democracy is not sustained by elections alone, right? Like citizens need habits and institutions through which they actually practice self-government. And I think this has a very strong parallel in India, because India is not simply a parliamentary democracy at the union level, right? It has constitutional federalism, state governments, panchayati raj institutions, municipalities, courts, political parties, a very engaging civil society organization, professional associations, and so on and so forth. So I think the Indian Constitution therefore provides multiple levels and channels through which citizens can participate in public life. Uh, for example, the Supreme Court describes India as a federal system with a separation of powers, right? Fundamental rights and independent judiciary. So all these things, I was like, okay, yeah, I think this is something that India also does. I mean, of course, the world he saw back in the day was very different from what it is now. And again, the geography and the diversity, all of that makes India a very distinct case. But I think there are a few things where I was like, okay, yeah, I can connect certain things because again, I'm not saying that it's exactly how an English town was. The whole township, local township, which she spoke about it again and again, is not exactly like that in India. But Panchayati Raj, which is like the village unions at the grassroots level, that's where the politics actually starts. The community comes in together. I think I was like, yeah, I can make certain similarities there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he really is taken by the townships for sure, and I mean, he does extend that to counties in the South, but I think Maria and I would both argue that the counties in the South are different than New England townships.
Yeah, and he certainly thought that.
He did, yeah. But he does say that there is sort of this, active democratic opportunity at the county level, where and I mean, and that makes sense. I mean, it's easier to act locally than it is to act nationally, right? So if you have opportunities to act locally, it kind of gives you respect for the system, in a way that and an appreciation for things and teaches you habits that otherwise might you might miss. Um, and I had a point that I was building to, and I completely lost it. Not for the first or last time for anybody who listens to this podcast on the regular. Um,
No, I want to jump in on this because I think this is, I mean, I don't know if we want to spend a lot of time on the associational token.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's where I was headed. So thank you, Grant.
Yeah. But I mean, this is the thing that, uh, I think is still really fascinating in the 21st century because there's sort of no doubt that in the United States, the federal government does a whole lot more than it did in 1830. And so I think this is why certainly those on, kind of on the right side of politics, by which I mean like conservatives or libertarians, are going to say, Tocqueville becomes a hero, right? Because Tocqueville's warning in the way that they would want to echo, that like democracy doesn't sustain itself the more centralized things become, right? It robs us of the power of those localities to be the incubators of democracy. I think that's not a Tocqueville phrase, right? That's
No,
uh
but he uses public school of democracy.
yeah, there you go. So something like that, right? And so I mean, I think this is a really interesting normative claim about democracy, right? Can it function when we are so atomized that our vote, in a sense, doesn't count? I mean, or it counts, but it counts as United States, what 1 100 millionth of a voice in government, something like that. And I mean, I think it's about 100 million people vote per, in a big election in the U.S., a little more probably. But I mean, it's closer to 1 billion. I don't know what it would be in India if everybody voted who is eligible to vote. But and in other words, it raises this question: is democracy a national phenomenon or is it a local phenomenon?
Right.
Is democracy a practice that extends all the way down into solving all problems, or is it and if so, but what happens as democracy centralizes more and more? Will those institutions continue to sustain themselves?
Yeah. I mean, Tocqueville distinguishes between what he calls administrative centralization and governmental centralization. And he says, the U.S. Constitution, combined with American history and the way that the states entered the Union, the people under the Union, not to say, but that whole process created a federal system. And federal systems are still really novel in the 1830s, right? And he, Um, he's coming to America at a time, and he keeps referring to them as the majority, where there really is this incredible majority in the US, like the Jacksonian majority, where they dominate every election essentially, certainly at the national level and at a lot of local, but not all local levels. And there is sort of this general cult, and he keeps referring to this cultural sort of supremacy as well that the Jacksonians have. I can't remember if it's in the essays that I gave you or not. I think it is, but where um, he describes the fact that like there's clearly some elites who are very unhappy with Jacksonian America, but they in public they profess being very happy. And isn't it so great that everybody gets a share in, getting to shape society? And meanwhile, they themselves have basically retreated from public life and live in opulence in private, right? Even though they disagree. But in public, they have almost adopted the trappings of the Jacksonian. So Tocqueville's, again, part of his question is this majority should be able to impose a really impressive tyranny, but it hasn't. And one of the things that he speaks to is one of the things that Grant you've talked to is just institutionally. There's governmental centralization, which means that the federal government does a few things, but in order to actually um, bring effectuate those laws, they're relying on local officials, local constables, local magistrates, some of whom might be with the majority and some of them might be with the minority party. And it means that you just need this cooperation that the federal government doesn't really have the ability to impose on, right? And so there's just these natural barriers to the Jacksonian majority becoming a suffocating authoritarian national tyranny, right? And which he compares to administrative centralization, which is the way that you had things going which was how things worked in Louis XIV's France, where the national government, the central government did everything. And therefore a change at the top could change everything. There weren't those institutional barriers that the United States had. Sorry, Grant, go ahead.
Yeah, as you say, I'm going to speak a little bit beyond my expertise, or maybe a lot beyond my expertise, because I'm not a 19th century historian.
It's okay, Grant. I speak beyond my expertise all the time.
That's me. That should probably be the name of this podcast.
Yeah, beyond our expertise. That's great. That's great.
But it seems to me that one of the historiographical issues about the 19th century, and especially in the last, say, 20 years, and within sort of people who want to do political history of the 19th century is exactly the tension you kind of brought up right there is how do you view the American state in the 19th century? And of course, there's one branch led by like Bill Novak, who I want to say, hey, the state is doing a whole lot. There's a myth of the weak American state. The American state was never weak; it was always very strong. And you go through like local laws, and they regulated everything, right? Sabbath worship, alcohol consumption, kind of all these things that today we'd say, they're violating all kinds of what we would think of as constitutional rights, right and left, because they can, right? Because that's what they democracy empowers them to regulate, sort of whatever. But the flip side is, I think what you point out, Rob, is this more kind of technical side, which is, but there's a much smaller distinction between the populace and the state, right? Like when it comes time to build a road, the 19th century, it wasn't that you hire, the federal government sent in a body of, professional road builders from DC that are going to go ahead and, take care of it. Kind of, you know, like I think maybe so I'm again way beyond my expertise, maybe more what you would expect in France, right? Like officials would show up and start saying, this is how it needs to be done and whatever else. But it was more, you had a town hall and you kind of all got together and said, all right, we got to build this road. Let's go do it. And so I think this is what Tocqueville's getting at is that creates a sort of a gap between the ability of a national majority to impose its will, because it will always be interpreted by the local community. And so what you get is, I think, if you fast forward a couple hundred years, not quite, but I think we call it fiscal federalism now, where there's this idea that the federal government can direct funds, it can initiate projects, but they always get reinterpreted by the states or the communities, which end up being the ones to implement them, and that this then undermines the tyranny of the majority. Or it maybe undermine is too strong a word. Diffuses maybe. It allows for that sort of imposition of central will to become diffused enough that it doesn't feel like an imposition, right? It feels more like, oh, okay, well, we gotta do this mandate. We're gonna do it this way, and we can get everybody locally involved, and that's true for road building again today. The federal government will give the funds, but ends up being sort of a state and then local proposition as to who actually builds them and where they get built and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, I don't want to speak beyond my expertise here. Again, 18th century France, not an expert. Even 19th century and even 1830s America, not an expert.
I'm thinking about like a book like Brian Ballows, is it Government Out of Sight, or something like that,
Right.
where the book is making an argument about how federal government is doing a lot more than you think in terms of infrastructure improvements. But then by the time it gets implemented, it has enough of a local flavor that it's out of sight. It doesn't
Yeah,
feel like the federal government doing it.
right. And it also helps, again, the local citizenry become involved. They're involved. Whereas it's not, you just do as you're told, you get to and it's not just simply a petition to the central authority. Like, we need you to do this. It's a little bit of money. We can build this ourselves. And I mean, I think this is so, I talked about the majority, example, this challenge potentially, or this threat of this overwhelming majority. But we've talked around associations, and we certainly used in the way that Tocqueville meant them to. But what else does he refer to as associations? Because he has a broader meaning for them. I mean, I'm thinking in the sense of, like, if people need a home built, like if people need any local thing built, there's a local committee struck, and they just kind of do it, right? And there's this notion, and they're going to do it, and nobody's asking the other person what their politics is.
Mhm.
And you start realizing, because there's all of these little, Edmund Burke has something similar that he calls little platoons, but Tocqueville civic associations, where there are, people are just working together in kind of an apolitical environment, and it allows you to get to know people on a personal level, and it allows you to appreciate them as individuals, and that, like, and then Charles Putnam, I think he built on this when he wrote Bowling Alone, um, where people use that bowling teams as the example that he uses, and you'd be on a bowling team, and maybe 4/5 of the bowling team would be Republican, and there'd be one Democrat, or vice versa, and maybe sometimes you thought that person was a little weird, but there was never any animosity. You were there to bowl, and that's what fundamentally mattered. And so there was this, and he looks at, if there's an American exceptionalism to some degree, at least socially, is he kind of looks at these things, and he says these are kind of absent culturally and socially, at least in France.
Right.
And that, yeah,
That freedom of association is so important to what he's talking about here, because not only is he talking about civic associations, which are obviously these places where people can have this experience in building a home or solving problems without the use of the government. So they're practicing essentially how the government works at the very local level within these civic associations. And I think that the freedom of association is something that also is a bulwark against the tyranny of the majority, because those are allowed to exist. You can have an association that speaks out against the federal government. You can have, even if it's not necessarily a political party, you can have these associations in public, where in France, a lot of that was pushed to private. And then you have conspirators. And he's got this great quote. And I've been looking for it in my notes and I can't find it. But essentially in France, he says you have conspirators. And in the United States, you don't have that because those associations can be open and free. And so this is such an important part of this through line with the what makes America exceptional, as he's talking about, and also what is a bulwark against the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah.
Just to add on to what Mary said, I think something that stood out to me personally was that I think for Tocqueville, uh, civic life is learned through participation. And associations teach individuals how to cooperate and take responsibility for matters beyond their private lives. And I think that is something that he found very fascinating in America. In that sense, I think civic association is uh, one of the mechanisms through which civic responsibility becomes a habit, which eventually becomes a central piece in his larger argument and observation about America.
Yeah. And I think it
Well
also,
said.
and I think that also builds into Tocqueville's sort of inherent, his inherent aristocrat, because he recognizes that these little civic associations are likely to be read by the town's most enlightened people,
Right.
and that therefore it will give people the common people exposure to their more enlightened leaders, which will show that first of all, they're not some evil, but they're not some evil thing. They're not like they're just, they're ordinary people who might just be a little more learned than you. Right. And so but again, it's about the more opportunities you create these cross-class relationships, to Tocqueville, and in non-necessarily political settings, the more opportunity for cooperation you have. Maybe not perfectly solving the collective action problem, but working towards a solution.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So, for what it's worth, when I teach Tocqueville, I like asking students, what was the first election you participated in? And they'll say, I haven't yet because they just turned 18 or whatever else. And I'll be like, no, think about it. Like, when was the first time you remember voting on something? And you kind of keep going, and they realize, um, they probably voted in a kindergarten or a first grade class for class president or whatever else. And I will say, so this is a little bit what Tocqueville's talking about is, there's this way that democracy as again, a collective action problem or a problem solving approach is embedded in the way we deal with everything, right? Like, you're on a double date and you're trying to pick what movie to go to. How do you resolve this? You take a vote. And I'm like, and so I'm like, this is what Tocqueville is talking about in terms of training Democrats, essentially, which is, um, in every sort of social gathering, whenever there's a conflict, we don't know what to do next. We sort of instinctively say, "Oh, no, we'll vote," right? And it has this. So I think Rob's exactly right. It has this first function of diffusing expertise, or I guess Tocqueville would say, as you said it, Rob, bringing the lower into the orbit of the higher citizenry, but it also legitimates the practice, which is, I think, really critical because the core question that seems to always be on the mind of any kind of political philosopher is, why does the minority agree to lose, right? Like, why am I okay? Why do I say, oh, the majority spoke? I guess I have to go along, right? Why don't I take up arms or secede or any of these sorts of things? And I think Tocqueville's trying to say, well, it's like because from like kindergarten on, we're just used to it. It just is the way we solve problems, and that's what all these associational and other kinds of organizational experiences get us to buy into. They legitimize the whole process.
My kids voted for donuts the other day in the car. I did not offer the election. I did not, but I was outvoted 2-1, and I had to inform them that while I appreciate their democratic enthusiasm,
Yeah.
this is not a democracy. So maybe I snuffed that out.
So you refuse to lose.
I refuse to lose.
No,
Exactly.
no soft despotism.
No,
You're
no,
right. Just kind of despotism.
honestly, I don't think my 2-year-old knew what he was voting on. And so I honestly think there were some election irregularities, if I'm being completely honest, watched by my 5-year-old.
Yeah, right.
Oh
Yeah.
God. And yeah, no, but I think what just Grant said, yeah, an excellent point. I think that really stood out to me when I read it for the first time. I think um when I read Tocqueville, I think what stood out to me, especially on this line, why a minority agrees to lose. And I think somehow people never thought that. I think the minority accepts, and I'm again speaking from a very Tocquevillian standpoint. I think the minority accepts losing because democracy gives it a legitimate way to continue participating. It can disagree with today's decision while accepting the procedure that produced it. And I think that is such an important distinction, which I found interesting in the write up. I think what Tocqueville wants to prevent is I think the majority using its victory to permanently silence or exclude the minority, right? I think majority rule, therefore, has to operate alongside constitutional protections and freedom of association. So I think that really stood out to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if there's one thing I can bring up on this point, only because the last time we were all together to talk about a classic American work, we talked about the Federalist Papers.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth noting the tension between Tocqueville and Madison, right? So Madison's great concern is factions, and the way faction, and how to sort of accommodate factions. And Tocqueville seems to be saying, actually, factions are where people learn how to practice democracy, right? It's
Yeah.
all of this coming together that is really, as a faction that's really important in order to keep democracy going. And I think that's a really, an interesting question to explore. Like which, as again, is a kind of a normative political philosophy question. Like, are factions the ruin of republics, or is Tocqueville onto something where, if contained in the right way, factions are the health of republics?
Yeah. And if he would, oh, I'm sorry, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah.
Just thinking about if he were writing when Madison were writing, what would he have thought of factions? Because by the time he's writing in Jackson's era, there are two parties. There's a political system by that point. This argument over factions is over. We've decided. So I wonder here, just in this kind of philosophical discussion, what he would have thought if he were there, not just reading Madison, but if he were there writing during Madison's time, if that would have changed his perspective. Because it was, I mean, Madison couldn't see that the opposition would willingly lose when he's thinking of that. And Tocqueville saw, okay, they will allow that.
Yeah, I mean, 1800, I mean, we can't overstate the importance of 1800 of that, right?
Right.
When the Federalists willingly cede power.
Right.
Um, and but I mean, there is this tension, but there is also one major common thread there between Madison and Tocqueville, which is fear of the majority,
Hmm.
Mhm.
right? Of an untrammeled majority, what can happen? And to some extent, Tocqueville's living in that, or Tocqueville's visiting the United States in that moment, right? And and in some ways, the system that Madison developed is being tested under Jackson. Like it's absolutely being tested under Jackson.
Right.
Jackson goes to the limit of what he's allowed to do, right? And um, so we could talk about this endlessly, but I do want to talk about one more thing, and then we he's a lawyer and he likes lawyers.
Yes. He does.
Um, what do you like? Judicial supremacy. Does he think that might be the secret? Aside from all the social and stuff that we've talked about, is that judicial supremacy the thing that I think and the acceptance of judicial supremacy, the thing that kind of holds it all together?
Yeah. So, and let me throw. I agree. It's a great question, and once again, I wish I knew more about the 19th century. But my kind of rough understanding is that people sued each other way more in the 19th century than today. Like the courts were involved in far more disputes. And I mean, they were typically, again, local courts. Look, and again, all these guys. I mean, it's to be an attorney, I'm pretty sure there's definitely not the same kind of formal process of, law school, passing the bar, licensure, all that kind of stuff.
You read law. That was it.
Right, exactly. So,
Yeah.
so again, it's a lot more amateurish, but the courts, I think I mean, I think it's a good question because he does seem to suggest that the courts play this very important diffusing role again, that by being a little slower, but by being formalized and all the rest, tended to reduce social conflict in a way that didn't force it into the legislative process, right? That didn't force it to go through an administrative process. It's sort of, once again, kind of the community coming together and I'm probably getting a little ahead of Tocqueville here, but it does seem that he has a sense, like you said, Rob, of an independent judiciary as the secret sauce, as performing this very important social function, resolving conflict, short of violence, in a way that everybody kind of seems to buy into.
Right. And he also says that like judges are the aristocrats in American society, right?
That's
However, they're the aristocrats that the majority accepts,
Right.
and they will accept them as aristocrats. And part of that is because when they sit on juries, they're participating in the process. They're the ones rendering judgment,
Mm.
right? Even if there's bench trials, the which there were, um, by the juries actively rendering judgment and just seeing the judge as like some almost independent arbiter, right? In a non-Solomon sort of way, right? Where, the people are making the decision, but that actually gives more credibility to the judicial aristocrats. And then, of course, and Tocqueville talks about this, that the one truly unique innovation of the American Constitution is the Supreme Court. And like that it can truly, in a way like nothing else, declare what is law and what is not. Even if it cannot really officially make law itself, of course, people can argue that it doesn't and can. Um, but do you see that? I mean, I think it's in Tocqueville, but I mean, do you guys think that the law and the legal system plays this important role in American society?
I think that part of what he's talking about is that it tempers radicalism because they rely on precedent. And so, yeah, if you look at the fact that they rely on precedent, which gives them more legitimacy as well, because people say, okay, this has happened. They're not radical themselves. And again, time and place here. What he's talking about a certain time and a certain era. But I do think the law is an important part of what he's saying here, and pushing back against that radicalism, pushing back against what he saw in France, because the courts do have that independence. And just like you said, serving on a jury is also a way for people to experience democracy, to experience control over this system, so they don't feel like it gets out of control.
Right. And it's funny. One of the things that he mentions is the importance of sitting on a civil jury rather than a criminal
Mhm.
jury. And
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, there are so few civil jury trials anymore,
Mm.
almost none, because, there's all these arbitration mechanisms that are set up. Going to trial so expensive. I mean, really the only people who go to trial very often anymore is in like family court and criminal court. Otherwise, everything's settled out of court, with the exception of, occasionally there's a case that goes, the stakes are so big it has to, but it's very rare. And I just wonder, I mean, how many Americans have experience sitting on a civil jury? How many Americans have experience sitting on a jury anymore?
Right.
Anyway, India, this is one distinct difference, I think, between the American Constitution and the Indian Constitution, is the role of judges. Even though judges are, of course, very important in India, there is very clearly legislative supremacy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know if it's a strong parallel, but I think Tocqueville sees the judiciary as one of the barriers preventing democratic majorities from exercising unlimited power. India's constitutional framework similarly gives judiciary a role in enforcing constitutional limits and fundamental rights. The Supreme Court states that the Constitution is the supreme legal authority and empowers the independent judiciary to invalidate legislation or government action that violates the Constitution. So in this case, it means that the Indian democracy or the democratic system contains an important Tocquevillian element. That is, democracy is constitutionally structured rather than being reduced to simple majority rule. And I think that is one um, similarity I could trace it to the whole Tocquevillian idea. So I think it is safe to say that India combines popular sovereignty with constitutional sovereignty.
Yeah.
And I think that stood out to me when I was reading it, especially if I apply the India lens.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I mean, you see in India, I mean, I simplified it. I shouldn't have said what I did, because I implied that it is just straight up legislative supremacy. It's not. It just, in certain cases, there is legislative supremacy in a way that doesn't exist in the United States. But for the most part, it's common law in India, right? And the common law is this deference to precedent that the population accepts.
Yeah, and I think that I'll tell you why. It's a colonial explanation. I mean, our colonial era, of course, shaped us in a big way. I think the big difference I could understand is that uh, Tocqueville, what he admired about the American judiciary was the restraint it showed, right?
Right.
And that's not the case in India. Restraint is not the thing. I think it's the judicial activism. It's basically judiciary is very actively involved in whatever that's happening in the civic space. So I think that's one distinction that stood out for me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true, because that's actually a really an interesting point, that in a lot of countries where the legislature is really strong, it's very, very strong, but where it's not really strong, the judiciary is extremely strong and can be very active. And so, whereas in the United States, it is a little more balanced, actually, which is interesting.
So one thing I'll just kind of throw out, one again, sort of in a teaching context. If you read John Adams or another one of the founders talking about mixed forms of government, so they're going back to the classics. There's a monarchy, there's aristocracy, there's democracy, and they say that the best constitution is going to be a mix of the three. It's very nice to then have Tocqueville come along and say essentially, right, that the judiciary is the aristocracy, right? It's a version of this, right? So you have a president, which is the one. The judiciary can be the aristocracy, and then the legislature can be the democracy, or you can kind of map this onto state and local government and so on. But this idea of like it functions precisely because it can be a bit of an aristocracy, right? It can be. And I think it's interesting. Like, we tend to think of judges as the best educated of government officials. Like, we want that, right? If they're on the Supreme Court, you'd better have gone not just to law school, but a really good law school. And
One of two, apparently.
yeah, hold it right. Yeah, usually right. It's usually Harvard or Yale. I think Notre Dame made it onto the
And
bench.
finally, yeah, it was a great democratizing of the Supreme Court.
Right. Exactly. And then on top of it, right, have maybe ideally taught at one of those institutions and so on. So so there is a kind of and we put them in robes, like there is a sort of aristocracy to the judiciary that
You could put them in wigs too.
they'll pick it up on, right? Exactly.
Anyway, we are running out of time, and I just want to. There is this sense of what could go wrong with the majority. Grant alluded to soft despotism earlier. I don't know if we have the time to really dig too far into that, but what is the great threat that Tocqueville's talking about in a democracy?
Part of it is just the civil society not being engaged. It's just people not realizing that their freedoms are slowly being taken away, because over generations, you just take those for granted. And so you don't even know what's slowly being chipped away at. So the less engaged we are, the less likely the democracy is to stand. And so that's just like on just a basic level, that's one of those threats.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think we haven't really talked about Tocqueville's interaction to sort of a kind of materialism and, I mean, writing it. I mean, another big thing happening early 19th century is a spread of a kind of commercial capitalism, and I think that it serves a good function in some ways to again be a release valve. So, Rob, you were talking about earlier, like the, the fact that not everybody's bought it. But of course, I choked on something right when I started talking. Somebody else talk for a second.
Um, well, I'm going to pivot to you, Akriti. What do you think is the great threat?
I think there are
Oh,
two
go on.
things that stood out for me. I think his first big major concern was individualism. So equality gives individuals independence, but it can also encourage them to withdraw into private life, in the form of family or career and, other material interests, I guess. And they eventually become less concerned with public affairs. I think if citizens stop participating, they become increasingly dependent on the administration. So I think this leads to you don't have the time to get into it, but soft despotism. So I think government can become increasingly protective and administrative without openly destroying the democratic institutions. Um, Citizens may continue to vote and retain formal rights, but gradually, I guess they surrender responsibility because the state can manage more of their lives. And I think that is something that really stood out for me when I was reading Tocqueville. And it's crazy how um, there's a reason why everyone goes back to Tocqueville. It has really stood the test of time. I think the other thing which he speaks about, which stood out for me, was I think the tyranny of the majority. So majority rule is essential to democracy, as we all know, but the majority must not become unlimited. And I think that is something that nuance he presented very well. I think majority opinion can exert social pressure and discourage independent thought, even without formal repression. I think this is why Tocqueville placed such importance on local government or voluntary associations or federalism or constitutional restraints. I think all of that, or judiciary for that matter. I think these institutions distribute power and give citizens opportunities to practice self-government. So I think these two things come to my mind.
Yeah, sorry, okay. I ate an M&M. Uh, it got me. I apologize. I choked there for a second.
Nothing screams material capitalist.
That's right. Like choking on an M&M. That's right. Yeah. So
Choking on our own prosperity, Grant.
that's right. We are a total metaphor. Very meta. So Akriti said it all right. I guess the only thing I was going to add is, yeah, I do think Tocqueville. I mean, he seems to admire the fact that, well, so the materialism that he kind of sees around him lends itself to a sort of mindset that frames democracy again in almost materialist ways, where it's like, uh, we do it because we get a better deal, right? It's like there's something in it for me. So, and it's also what brings us together. It's like we combine together because collectively we can solve this problem, and so, but it's very utilitarian. And I think he does worry that utilitarian soil may not be rich enough to sustain the flower of democracy, right? It's if it's just a kind of selfish, I'm doing this because in the long run I will be materially better off. That may not be enough to get through the hard times. And which you kind of look historically backwards, like, if you have a period like a Great Depression, was that a moment at which democracy could be abandoned? And it certainly was in a lot of other countries, right? So, and so you'd say, well, Tocqueville's maybe onto something there, where it's like democracy only survives so long as it provides the goods. But once material growth slows, will people go right to, like Recre said, turn to a soft despotism or even worse, right? Depending on how bad the economic downturn is.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the, Creedy said that Tocqueville stands the test of time very well, and I think he does. One of the things about Tocqueville is whatever you want, you'll find it here,
Yeah.
right? This is one of the reasons I'm so curious to talk with people about Tocqueville, is that people get different things from him. And there is an eye of the beholder. I think there is stuff that if you want to see it, you'll find it in here. So for instance, if you want to see um democracy or liberty as being related to some sort of like inner virtue, you'll find that in Tocqueville. If you want to see it as well, actually, it's institutional structure, you'll find that in Tocqueville.
Yeah.
Is it some mix of the two? You'll find it in Tocqueville, and you can find it in or whatever else so many other things that you're looking for. One of the passages that I reread for this and that I maybe hadn't appreciated the first time I read it was that role of majority opinion that Acreedy was referring to, and just how coercive majority opinion can be. You'll retain your rights. Your property isn't going to be taken from you. Your life will not be forfeit. Yet you seem to conform. We know you disagree. Why did you conform? And you almost like don't even realize you're conforming or that you're going against your beliefs. And Tocqueville recognizes this. And this is what he says is so dangerous about a democracy. And he doesn't use this word because he's predating this word by 100 years, but there's this totalitarianism in democracy that, Louis the 14th was, France was never totalitarian, right? Because the people still had their own thoughts. The people still had their own, privately they would do things that, you know, they would almost do subversive things for a laugh, right? That everybody knew what they were doing, but they were totally safe. It was never going to cause, but it would almost be this galvanizing social thing and cultural thing. But in a democracy, the majority has this incredible ability to coerce public opinion softly. And that's another aspect of this potential soft despotism, right? Where it's the despotism of public opinion. And that if you're too far outside of it, you are going to be so socially ostracized. The threat of being so socially ostracized is enough, even if you don't lose your actual physical liberty. You'll you'll be so socially ostracized that it it can be devastating that you'll just comply. Right.
Yeah.
And if we're, you know, um, in an era where we all communicate, and for so many kids, their relationships are online. So many young people, their relationships are online. Social ostracism is closer to social death than maybe it's ever been.
Yeah, and this is, I think Tocqueville's onto something because, and you guys can correct me, but it seems like when the internet first appeared, the idea was this was going to democratize information. It'd be easier to get heterodox views because who's policing the internet? And that the irony, of course, is that the opposite happened, right? And Tocqueville was onto something, right? That by allowing more voices in, it somehow created a kind of tyranny of the majority when it came to opinions and news sources and all this sort of stuff where we all tended to now get access to the same news sources, and it's been the death of local news, and it has had the opposite effect. Yeah. So I think that's right. I think he's onto a kind of dynamic that is counterintuitive. The
Right.
more voices you let in, the fewer opinions you get. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we need an arch judge of the internet. We need an internet aristocracy.
So the one thing I want to go back to why he's a classic, why maybe we all ended up saying we had to talk about him, and Rob, I think you hit on a lot of things. I mean, there's everything you want is in Tocqueville. So it occurred to me as I was prepping, some people go to Tocqueville because he's descriptive. He's a sociologist of a particular moment in time, and if you're a historian, like that's it's just gold, right? It's he
Yeah.
was doing exactly what you'd want somebody to do in that period to help you write your book, and so he's a sociologist of 1830s, early, mid Republic or mid early Republic America, something like that. Okay, he's also normative. He's a political scientist. He's trying to describe what will make democracy work. So he's saying, this is how it functions and kind of in some ways how it has to function if it's going to avoid all of the Robespierre or other kinds of fates of other sorts of republics, past or recently. that from his time. And then the last thing is he's kind of prophetic. So he's making predictions about how things are going to go. And so you can go to Tocqueville for a description. You can go to Tocqueville for normative claims, or you can just start off your essay by saying, or your article or whatever else you're writing. Tocqueville once said, this is going to happen. And now it doesn't matter whether it happened or not. It's the perfect way to start your, start whatever you're writing about, because, he's made a prediction that you can go back to. And anyway, so he's like, it's hard to not just be like, yeah, I'm going to start everything I write with Tocqueville.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that your point there is Tocqueville can be framed as prophecy,
Yeah.
right? What you're reading here is prophecy. And I think that makes it it makes it so much more interesting to read when you're reading him as prophecy.
Great. Yeah.
All right, we are totally out of time here, and I want to be fair to everybody. Marie, what final thoughts?
I think that the idea that we're reading this as prophecy or reading it, from a president's view is interesting. I think that's right. And I think that we can gain a lot of understanding about ourselves today and what could have been or what didn't happen from reading Tocqueville. So, not only from a historical lens, but also from the present, looking back at our government. And I like how Grant brought up Schoolhouse Rock in the beginning, because he is talking about what, like, the 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 potential here and what it's supposed to be. What the ideas are and what he's saying, but what it's supposed to be. And so it is this kind of golden age that we like to think back on from when we did learn from Schoolhouse Rock when we were young. So yeah, and I think this conversation was very illuminating overall.
Creedy.
Um, I think Brand touched something which I wanted to speak. So I'm glad that he brought it. I think he spoke about how descriptive, um, the work is of Tocqueville. There's this one section which really stood out to me when I was reading, and I think it was the majority tyranny. I think that section, and um, the way he described it, I have it in front of me, so I really wanted to talk about this. I think he said that local institutions like municipalities and counties, they function like hidden shoals, which slow down or divide the flood constituted by the popular will. So he's basically making everyone picture the tide, right? And he's associating the tide with the majority opinion or a law the majority wants. And he's calling that tide as a flood coming in. And the shoals don't stop it. They just break it up or slow it down and divert it into channels so it doesn't hit everything at once with full force. And I think that kind of sort of blew my mind when I was reading it as a postgraduate. And I went back to it again. So I think that really stood out to me, the way he explained whatever his ideas were and observations were, because it was so descriptive. So I think for me, that stood out was that he not only described America, I think he went one step ahead. He saw America as a laboratory of understanding democracy itself. And I think there were a lot of questions he answered, and there were a lot of questions he sprinkled everywhere, questions which we can go back to even now. And I think sometimes half of the thing is just about asking the right questions. He asked questions like, how does equality affect liberty at that time? Something we can go back to even today, right? So I think, or for that matter, how do citizens learn self-government? Something that every country is trying to understand, or every democracy for that matter. So yeah, I think Tocqueville is going to be with us till we turn 80 or 90 or whatever. We are always going to come back to Tocqueville.
Grant, I'll
Uh,
I'll give you the final word.
I'm going to do what I did last time you did this to me. I want to let you have the final word, because I know this is close to your heart too. So I reserve my time, and what's the way to say this in Congress?
Yield?
I concede time to
Yeah. Will the gentleman yield?
Canada.
Yeah.
I yield my time. That's it. I yield my
Yield
time
my
to
time.
a gentleman from Canada.
Yeah. I honestly, I don't have much more to say than I already have. I mean, I could talk, we could all talk endlessly about Tocqueville. I think the way of finishing, you mentioned his he's a sociologist. He's so descriptive. In some ways, he's a liberal Marx in that sense, in that Marx kind of touches on, he's a historian, he's an economist, he's a sociologist, and they kind of all get mixed up together. But when he's a sociologist, I think there's a lot of um there's a lot of parallels in the way that they describe things, the way that they analyze things. Obviously, they're come to very different conclusions and have very different premises that they're operating from. But I think it's actually the fact that, in a way that, say, like, David Ricardo is writing around the same time as a really prominent economist, but few people would be able to point to their favorite David Ricardo passage. Um, and it's when these great scholars of the period are kind of have this sociological bent that have given them an enduring legacy, I think, and because they do so much for us. So um, I'm saying nice things about sociologists. There we go. But on that note, thank you very much. I thought that was a great discussion. This is the start of season 2. If you're interested, please like and subscribe. It's been a lot of fun, and we got a lot of really, really fun stuff on deck. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob, Marie, for letting us crash the party.
Great
Thank
to
you.
be here,
Great
guys.
job. Yes, thank you